How do we explain Jehovah's righteous arrangement, his perfect righteous arrangement, from a human point of view? It would be a lot easier to explain it if we were one of those spirit creatures in the heavenly realm. But from a human point of view, how do we explain it without coming across as sort of dogmatic and sort of like BBC reporter bias? Well, I'm going to have a go. I need to have a go at explaining it. So to explain this, we have to go to the highest source available. And that, of course, is with Jehovah God and his Son Jesus Christ. Now, Jehovah God and Jesus Christ together, they're the ones that would source out the food, the spiritual food. This is going to be explained in culinary terms, in cookery terms, because I think it lends itself to that kind of example. So the food will be of the highest order, the food that they source out from where they are, in that vantage point that they're in. That food that eventually finds its way to the table of the spiritually hungry, that food at the source level will be of the highest order, but it's still uncooked. It hasn't been prepared to make it palatable for digestion. So that food then, that food is given to the chefs. And the food and the chefs are also given a recipe. For the sake of this argument, the recipe could be God's word, the Bible. So the chefs will be given that recipe, and they've to follow that recipe according to the letter of the law. Not to add their own ingredients into it, but to follow the recipe which will be listed. If at any point they deviate from that recipe and decide to put something of their own into the recipe, then the end result is that they're not going to get as pleasing a dish as they would have done if they'd have followed the recipe to the letter of the law. I'm now going to bring in 1975 and explain what I think possibly happened. One governing body member acted independently, was no longer following the absolute letter of the law recipe that would have been given to him through the faithful and discreet slave, who are the ones that were preparing the food at the proper time. You've heard this expression many, many times in the Bible, haven't you? That the faithful and discreet slave prepare the food at the proper time. So it only took the one faithful and discreet slave, anointed one, to no longer follow the exact instructions. And so this wasn't picked up. So he contaminated what would have been a perfect dish and something that would have been palatable for the hungry spiritual ones. Quite frankly, if we have to name names, it could have been Raymond France that was the one that didn't follow the spiritual recipe. That he actually introduced some independent thinking at that time, and thus there was a fallout from his deviation from the ingredients that he should have stuck religiously to. I know that seems a bit of a story in itself, but I'm trying to explain this perfect righteous arrangement which starts at the highest level. It then moves to a lower level, which will be the chefs, the faithful and discreet slave. So they then prepare the raw food stocks that Jehovah and Jesus source out. The chefs prepare it and stick to the recipe without deviation. And then it moves down to another level, because then the dishes that have been prepared by the chefs have to be transferred to the table. Quite frankly, it will be the elders that will act as the waiters in this culinary example. The chefs have prepared the food, they're happy with the food, they've looked over the food. They then pass it to the waiters. The waiters can also look at the food and the dish themselves at any stage. And if they look at the dish and it isn't what they expected, then they can question it with the chefs. And that is what should have happened. If someone gives you something, you look at it, it doesn't seem right, you have the right to question it. So, back to the example. So the waiters, the elders, who are acting as the waiters on this occasion, they then transfer that food to the table. The ones that are sitting at the table are the spiritually hungry. They're there because they're hungry, that they're yearning to be fed. So this is where the food at the proper time comes in. The proper time is when you're hungry. You're not always hungry, because once you've eaten, you've then satisfied that spiritual hunger until next time you're hungry. So the food at the proper time is put before them. It's what they've wanted, and it satisfies their palate and their digestive system. But those that are partaking at the table, they too can look at that food at any stage. They can look at it, they can see, is it a good dish? Is it what I expected to be served up? If it's not what they expected, they too can question it and not eat it. They can take that complaint to the waiter. The waiter can take that complaint to the chef. The chef, faithful and discreet slave in this culinary exercise example, would then have to pray over it, wouldn't he? In spiritual terms. But in actual terms, what would a chef do? Probably remove the contamination. If it was just one person that was sat at the table that made the complaint, just the one out of, say, many thousands, then it would have been a freak accident, wouldn't it? How that contamination got there. But if thousands of dishes were contaminated at that point, then it's much more serious. Very serious. Because it means that someone allowed the contamination from the kitchen and didn't spot it to then filter after the waiter's carrying it to the table and still didn't spot that contamination. Now, was that done on purpose? Or was that an oversight? Because it shouldn't happen in a real professional kitchen arrangement. It is very, very rare that you would get a succession of dishes that are contaminated and not fit for consumption. It is usually picked up by the waiter, or even before that, the chef will spot that the dish he's just prepared is not as perfect as it should be, and he will then not allow that dish to be served. And quite frankly, he will prepare another dish. Food at the proper time. It's when you're hungry. Because you're not always hungry, are you? After you've just eaten a huge feast, you've then been satisfied until next time, when that hunger starts to build up again. And the spiritually hungry, in this case those that are sat down at the table, after them receiving a large sumptuous meal, have then been fed for that time period until next time, when that hunger starts to build again. And that for me is food at the proper time. Now, to recap, where do we start? We start at the highest source, Jehovah and Jesus Christ, who source out the food. They give that food to the slave class, the faithful and discreet slave, are the chefs who prepare the food according to a recipe, the recipe being the Bible. When they're satisfied with the food that they've prepared, they pass it to the waiters being the elders, who were waiting on the hungry, the spiritually hungry. So they transfer that food, and they have every right to examine it along the way. They do not need to serve any food that they believe to be contaminated. But if they are satisfied with that food, it is then transferred and distributed to the group of hungry ones, spiritually hungry ones. And they too have the right not to eat of that food if they don't believe it to be of the highest order. And that is my explanation as to what Jehovah God's righteous, perfect arrangement is from a human point of view. Thank you.